The brass lamp on the corner of Maigret's desk gave off a gentle glow, warming the room just enough to soften the draught seeping through the courthouse windows. It was a Friday evening in early November, and Paris had turned to its habitual grey, the kind of damp, lingering cold that settled in the bones and made everyone just a little more tired than usual. Maigret sat quietly, not reading, not working, but simply sitting, his heavy overcoat still on, his hat resting neatly on the windowsill. A small pot of coffee, mostly cooled, sat at the edge of the desk. He poured what remained into a cup and took a slow sip, watching the shadows shift as people crossed the stone courtyard outside. He wasn't waiting for a call, not officially. He had told Janvier he'd be at the office late, but it was just a pretense. There was something about the day, its sluggish air, the silence between colleagues that kept him from going home. He'd spoken with Madame Maigret around 5 o'clock. She was preparing endives with ham for supper. He had promised to be home by 7. Now it was nearly 8. He had not called again. It wasn't that anything was wrong. It was the opposite. Too little was happening. The quiet had a weight to it. When the phone rang, it didn't startle him. He reached for it without urgency. "Maigret," he said, a beat. Then the voice of Inspector Lewis. "From the 9th arrondissement. Young, polite, eager. There's been a death at the Opera Garnier. A woman found on one of the upper balconies. At first glance, natural causes. But something's not right, sir." Maigret didn't ask for details. He didn't ask who the woman was or how she died. He simply nodded, placed the receiver back into its cradle, and stood up slowly. The coat was still warm from his shoulders. He took it up again, pulled on his gloves, and left without turning out the lamp. Outside, Paris was shivering beneath. A fine mist, not quite rain, not quite fog. The gaslights along the boulevards gave the city a golden sheen that dissolved into damp walls and puddled stones. The taxi ride was brief, the kind of ride where both driver and passenger say nothing, only letting the hum of the tires over wet streets provide conversation. The opera stood massive and inert, its lights dimmed except for the entrance, where a small police car idled, and a pair of uniformed officers leaned against the archway, smoking without speaking. Inside, the familiar hush of velvet and marble greeted him, not silence, but a particular kind of stillness. The echo of past performances still clinging to the red walls, the hush of old money and rehearsed applause. A custodian in a navy uniform led Maigret up the side stairs. No crowd, no fanfare, just soft soles on thick carpeting, past framed portraits and fading murals of angels and tragedians. The woman was seated on the left side of the 3rd balcony, her coat neatly folded beside her, her hands resting in her lap. She might have been listening to music, except there was none. Inspector Lewis stood nearby, awkward in his stance, as if afraid of disturbing something. He gave Maigret a small nod. "She's been here nearly 2 hours. No one noticed until the usher tried to clear the house. Her ticket stub says she came in just before the first act." Maigret stepped closer. Her eyes were closed. She was in her late 40s, perhaps 50, with carefully arranged hair and a pearl clasp on her coat. He noticed her shoes first. Not scuffed, not new, worn, but polished. A woman who had taken care to come here looking decent. She had not come in a hurry. Her gloves were folded, her handbag closed. No sign of distress. No bruising. Maigret asked quietly. Louis shook his head. Doctors downstairs. Says it could be natural. Heart or something else. Wheel. No more by morning. Maigret looked at the woman's left hand. A gold ring, thin, barely noticeable. No markings. Her nails were clean, but not manicured. He looked around the balcony. No purse. No opera glasses. Just the coat. And the silence. Maigret sat in the seat beside hers. Where was she sitting exactly? He asked. There. Louis pointed. But the usher moved her a little to check for a pulse. Maigret sat back. The theatre was empty now. The stage curtains still down. From where they were, one could just see the curve of the orchestra pit and the first few rows of the main hall. She had sat here alone, and no one had spoken to her. No one had heard her fall ill. No sound, no movement, just gone. Has anyone identified her? Not yet. Maigret looked at the coat. He leaned forward and checked the inside pocket. A name tag. Ememy, El Danderand. No address. He said nothing. He stood again and walked slowly to the edge of the balcony, looking down at the stage. A cleaner moved below, sweeping between the seats. It wasn't the music, Maigret said aloud. To no one in particular. She wasn't here for the opera. Louis looked puzzled. But her ticket, yes, a seat with a poor view, alone. She could have afforded better, but she didn't want better. She just wanted to be here. They stood in silence for a long moment. Maigret pulled his coat tighter. The air in the opera house was growing colder. Send someone to her building. Danderand isn't a common name. She likely lives alone, quietly. Louis nodded and moved away. Maigret remained there a moment longer, staring down at the stage that had seen 100 dramas, 1,000 deaths imagined by actors. This one was real, and yet quieter than fiction allowed. He didn't know why he felt uneasy. There was no blood, no violence, nothing to suggest anything had happened at all. And yet, he thought, there was a reason she came here to die. A faint sound echoed below, a door closing somewhere in the stone corridors. It was a quiet death. But something was wrong, and Maigret knew he wouldn't sleep that night. The concierge at 17 Rue de Boucher didn't bother asking for identification. She simply looked at Maigret's hat and coat, and without needing to be told who he was, turned back toward the open doorway and gestured him in with a tired flick of the wrist. She was quiet. The woman muttered, very quiet, never made a fuss, paid rent on time, didn't even complain when the hot water was out in January. Maigret gave a brief nod, stepping past the small potted plant by the stairwell, its leaves browned and curled from neglect. The building was one of many like it, 3 floors. Old wallpaper, stairs that creaked but never collapsed. He followed. The smell of burnt cabbage and stale perfume up to the 2nd floor, where Inspector Louis was waiting with a thin man in wire-framed glasses and a coat to sizes too large. Her name is Lee Danderand, Lewis said quietly as Maigret arrived. 51, widow, no children, retired office clerk from the Ministry of Finance. Been living here 12 years. The man beside him cleared his throat awkwardly. I'm Monsieur Baudoin, the building's administrator. I only ever spoke to her at lease renewals. Never heard her raise her voice. Maigret didn't answer. He simply opened the apartment door and stepped inside. The room was neat, not obsessively clean, but arranged with care. A pair of slippers rested. At the foot of the bed, a small vase on the table held two wilted carnations. On the mantel was a photo of a man in military uniform, old, sun-faded, possibly from the Algerian War. The curtains were closed, but not drawn tightly. A faint line of light sliced through the room like a forgotten memory. He stood in silence, letting the atmosphere settle. There was no sense of struggle, no overturned furniture, no unfinished meal, just a quiet, orderly space that spoke of routine, not distress. He looked over at a worn green notebook lying closed on the nightstand. He didn't open it, not yet. In the small kitchen, a pan with dried egg yolk still sat on the stove. Breakfast had been late, or forgotten. The sink was empty, save for a teaspoon. She dressed herself carefully, Maigret said quietly, as Lewis stepped in behind him. Chose gloves, folded her coat, took the time to polish her shoes. Lewis looked around. It still seems like natural causes, of course, Maigret said, but something in her day changed. She went to the opera, alone, without telling anyone, and she didn't bring a purse. He pointed to the hallway table. No empty space, no keys missing. She locked the door behind her, and she didn't expect to come back. They searched the desk drawers together, slowly, carefully, receipts, letters from insurance, an old note from her sister-in-law dated 2 years back, never replied to. Maigret's hands paused over a sheet of music, yellowed at the edges. Berlioz, he murmured, from Les Troyens, the opera playing last night. She wasn't a regular at the opera, Lewis added. The usher said they'd never seen her before, and she bought the ticket yesterday at the box office. In cash, there was no diary, no recent correspondence. The only telephone number listed on the small pad by the wall was the bakery downstairs. Maigret crossed to the mantel again and looked at the photograph. The man's face was stern, but not unkind. He had thick eyebrows and a cigarette in hand. Her husband? Lewis asked. Possibly, Maigret said. But there's no frame, just propped against the wall. He moved toward the wardrobe. Inside were 6 dresses, hung precisely, with the hangers evenly spaced. One coat missing, the same one she had worn last night. Shoes neatly lined up at the bottom, and on the top shelf, beside a small tin of mints. A white envelope tucked beneath a stack of winter scarves. Maigret pulled it free and opened it. No address, just a note, handwritten, careful cursive. He'll be there. I know he will. It's always the same balcony. I want him to see me, just once. No signature, no date, nothing else. He handed it to Lewis, who read it twice and looked confused. She was meeting someone. No, Maigret replied. She wasn't meeting. She was watching. He looked back toward the window, which now showed the outline of dusk settling in. Somewhere behind them, the concierge coughed deliberately. "Who lives directly across from the opera?" Maigret asked suddenly. "Not near it, but with a view of the left balcony from their box." Louis frowned. "I'd have to check the seating plan." "Do that," Maigret said, "and check who owns or rents boxes along that level. I want names." He turned again to the photograph on the mantel. The face stared back at him, offering nothing. Outside the building, Maigret stopped and lit his pipe beneath the flickering street lamp. The night had thickened, the mist curling. Tighter now, clinging to shoulders and breath, a bus rolled past, its lights gliding like ghosts over the pavement. From inside the bakery next door, a bell jingled faintly as a customer left. Maigret peered in. A plump woman behind the counter was wiping her hands on her apron. "She used to come in?" he asked, stepping in without preamble. "Madame Danderand, every morning. Always the same half a baguette, small coffee, never more than a few words. Yesterday," the woman blinked. "She came early, earlier than usual. Seemed not nervous, but distracted. Didn't wait for the coffee to cool. Burned her tongue, I think." "She say anything else?" "No, but she asked me to wrap the baguette with extra care. Said she'd be taking it with her for a walk." "A walk?" The woman shrugged. "She never said where, but she wasn't dressed for walking." Maigret thanked her and stepped back into the night. The wind had picked up slightly, nudging a newspaper down the curb. He stood a while, watching the windows above. The second-floor window was still dark. The room would sit untouched for now, but he felt something, not urgency, not panic, but a sense of intrusion, as though Lee Danderand had made a decision meant to remain invisible, and someone had seen her anyway, or chosen not to. A quiet life, a quiet death, but in between, one unspoken moment, a need to be seen. Maigret stood there, pipe smoldering slowly, wondering who had been in that balcony the night before, and whether they had noticed the woman to rows behind them, watching not the opera, but them. The office at the Opera Garnier reserved for administrative staff was a tidy glass-walled enclosure. At the rear of the building, perched behind a small reception area that smelled faintly of floor polish and aging velvet. It was there, early the next morning, that Maigret sat with his coat still damp from the morning drizzle, listening quietly as the theatre's head of operations thumbed through a seating chart. "There are 3 private boxes directly across from the upper left balcony," the man explained, tapping the floor plan with a stubby pencil. "Boxes 5, 6, and 7. Box 6 is rarely used these days. Belongs to an elderly woman in newly Madame Cazeneuve. She hasn't attended a performance in over a year." "And the other 2?" Maigret asked. "Box 5 is reserved by the Ministry of Culture, mostly used for diplomatic guests, but last night it was empty." The man hesitated a moment longer, then added, "Box 7 is owned technically by a man named Roland Fabert, retired banker, wealthy, comes now and then, always alone." Maigret made no note of the name. He simply repeated it aloud. "Fabert. Yes, the man confirmed. He arrived about 10 minutes before the overture last night. Had a reserved pass at the ticket counter. Anyone sit with him? Never. He prefers solitude. Some of the staff find him a little strange. He stares at the crowd more than the stage. Maigret asked for the details on the ticket purchases from the day before. He was handed a small printout with handwritten notations in the margins. There, the man said, Madame Dandurand, paid in cash, no phone number, no address. Chose a left balcony seat without assistance. Simply pointed. Maigret turned to the usher who had first found her. Did you notice her before the performance began? The usher was young, perhaps 22, and trying not to fidget in his uniform. She seemed expectant, not nervous, but definitely looking for something. She kept glancing to the right, toward the private boxes. I thought maybe she was meeting someone, but no one ever joined her. She didn't remove her coat. Maigret nodded. Thank you. He returned to the police van, waiting outside, and asked Louis to find the address for Roland Fabert. As the car moved through the waking streets, Maigret lit his pipe and remained silent, watching raindrops gather along the edge of the window. His silence made Louis uneasy, but he didn't interrupt. They arrived at a tall, limestone building on Avenue Victor Hugo, with brass railings and a concierge who spoke in clipped tones. Monsieur Fabert is home, but I can't guarantee he'll receive you. He doesn't like unannounced guests. Maigret gave her a small smile. Tell him it's not a guest. They were admitted after a wait. The apartment was large, with carpets too thick for comfort and furniture too expensive to be inviting. Fabert was already seated in a high-backed armchair near the window, a half-empty glass of liqueur in hand. Though it was barely past 10 in the morning, he did not rise. He merely gestured toward a pair of lower chairs without looking at them directly. You're here about the woman, he said. Maigret remained standing. Then, you know, I read the morning paper. Woman dies at the opera. It's not so unusual. The theater's full of ghosts already. But you saw her. Fabert turned his head now. He was in his 60s, bald at the crown, with small sharp eyes and a mouth that looked used to frowning. I noticed her, to Rose behind me. Upper left, she didn't move much, but she wasn't watching the performance. She was watching me. And how did that make you feel? Fabert gave a short, humorless chuckle, like I'd seen a ghost myself. You knew her. There was no answer for a long time. Then, years ago, we worked in the same office. Ministry of Finance. She was plain, quiet, efficient. I was married, just starting out. She made no claims, no scenes, just disappeared, transferred to a different department. Maigret said nothing. He let the silence do the work. She had a way of looking at you, Fabert continued, like she knew everything you didn't say. Some people smile to be polite. She didn't smile. She just stayed present. And you hadn't seen her since. No, never, until last night. She came to see you, Maigret said gently. She came to see something, Fabert replied, his voice tightening. But I don't believe she expected to speak. She didn't wave, didn't stand, just sat there. It unnerved me. Why? Because I felt like I was being remembered. Not accused, not blamed, just remembered, exactly. Margaret watched him for a long moment. The room was silent except for the ticking of a brass carriage clock on the mantel. Did you leave your box at any point during the performance? No. I stayed until the end. Left by the side door. As always. Margaret reached into his coat and removed the folded note. He passed it to Fabbert. The man read it once, then set it down slowly on the table beside his drink. She wanted me to see her, he whispered, to recognize her, perhaps to feel something. Regret. Margaret waited. She was never dramatic, Fabbert added, almost defensively, not the type to blackmail or threaten. If she meant to haunt me, she did. So with dignity. Margaret studied his face. The man was not grieving, nor was he anxious. But there was a tremor in his left hand as he reached again for the liquor. I didn't kill her, Fabbert said suddenly. No, Margaret replied calmly. I don't believe you did. He turned toward the window, where the rain had now thickened into a steady patter. Paris was blurred behind the glass. But I do believe, he added, you were the last thing she chose to see. They left the apartment without arrest, without accusation, on the street. Louis glanced sideways at Margaret as they walked. You believe him? Yes, Margaret said. But it doesn't mean nothing happened. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Margaret placed the note in a file marked Dandurand, L, and sat in his office with a coffee that had gone cold again. He stared at the folder and thought not about facts, but about memory, about the kind of silence that builds for decades and ends not in shouting but in presence. A woman alone in a theatre. A man who remembered too late. A ticket bought not. For music. But for a moment Dot, and now Margaret could feel it something still lay unspoken. Something not yet quite right. The way the ticket was purchased. The missing purse. The woman's shoes, polished too deliberately. He needed to find the rest of her story. Not because the law demanded it, but because she had walked into that. Theatre not just to die but to be seen. It was mid-afternoon when the call came from Montmartre. The sun had made a half-hearted appearance above the chimneys, only to retreat behind a veil of thin clouds, turning the city's usual grey a touch. Paler, Margaret had been seated in his office, not reading, not thinking, simply waiting until Janvier entered, cap in hand. A woman came to the station in the 18th. He said, claims she knew Madame Dandurand, says they had tea every Wednesday. Margaret rose at once, taking his hat from the rack but leaving his pipe unlit. He had a strange feeling, not of urgency, but of something being ready like a kettle just before the boil. The building was near Rue des Trois Frères, behind a small bakery, and up a steep flight of worn steps that seemed to sigh under every footfall. The apartment belonged to a Madame Clotilde Machelin, a stout woman in her 60s, who wore her hair in a coiled bun and answered the door with her coat already on, as if expecting to go out but uncertain where. She wasn't my friend exactly, Clotilde said as she waved them into the cramped living room. But she came. Every week. Without fail. Wednesdays at 3. She'd bring her own tea in a silver thermos. Said she preferred it that way. I never minded. The room smelled of boiled cabbage and violets. A half-whereupon scarf lay draped over the arm of a faded armchair. Everything in the room felt paused, like it had been waiting for this interruption. "When did you see her last?" Maigret asked gently. "This week," Clotilde said. "The day before yesterday." She looked tired, worn, but not sad, just finished, you know, as if she'd finally decided something. Maigret nodded. "Did she mention the opera?" Clotilde hesitated. "She did. She said she had plans for the weekend, that she would be watching an old chapter turn its last page. That's how she put it." "What did she mean?" "I didn't ask. With Lee, you didn't push. She wasn't evasive, just private. But I could tell it meant something. She wore a brooch I'd never seen before. Silver, shaped like a leaf, very delicate. Was she sentimental?" "No, never. She was dry, precise. And yet, I always had the sense there was more behind her than she allowed. Once, years ago, I asked if she'd ever married again. She laughed, not cruelly, but as if it were a question from another lifetime." Maigret looked around the small room. There were no photographs on the walls, only a faded mirror and a clock that ticked unevenly. "Did she talk about the past?" "Not directly, but sometimes. She'd tell stories without names. Office affairs, a man who once left flowers without a note, a woman who stole lipstick, little things." "Did she ever mention a man named Fabert?" Clotilde frowned. "I think she did, but not recently. Years ago. She said he was the kind of man who smiled only when being watched. That he understood power, but not people." Maigret stood. He glanced at the scarf again, then back at Clotilde. "She liked music." "No, not at all. Said it made her nervous." "Then why the opera?" Clotilde looked up sharply at that. "I don't know. She never mentioned going to performances. Said they were full of people pretending to feel." Maigret remained silent a moment, then asked, "Do you remember the brooch? Did she leave it behind?" "I doubt it," Clotilde said, standing now, too. "But I can check." They searched the hallway coat rack and her teacup shelf. Nothing. No brooch. No trace. Just the same silver thermos, now washed and left to dry beside the sink. Back at the office, Maigret sat in his chair again, the folder still open. The facts were few, the emotion subtle, yet something small and deliberate threaded it all together like a lace collar stitched by a patient hand. He reviewed the timeline again. Madame Danderand had bought her ticket the day before the performance. She had polished her shoes, folded her gloves. She'd gone to Montmartre for tea. She'd said goodbye, but only in her way. Janvier entered again, this time holding a narrow parcel. This came from the cleaning crew at the opera, he said. Found beneath the seat cushion. Wedged in tight. They nearly missed it. Maigret opened the parcel. Inside was the silver brooch Clotilde had described, delicate, shaped like a falling leaf, with a faint engraving on the back. Just 3 letters. R.F. Maigret stared at the initials a long time. Not a gift she wore often, he said aloud. No, Janvier agreed, but carried it with her that night. It wasn't for decoration, Maigret murmured. It was a message, not to us, to him. He turned the brooch over again. The clasp was broken. It must have fallen unnoticed as she sat there, watching him, remembering. She didn't want revenge, he added. She wanted to show she remembered everything, and that he had forgotten nothing. There was a stillness between the two men. "Do we speak to Fabbert again?" Janvier asked. "No," Maigret replied. "We've already said what needed saying." He leaned back and stared out at the rain again, still falling, quietly. He thought of the silver thermos, the brooch, the woman in the balcony, the tea on. Wednesdays, all her movements had been private, deliberate, never seeking attention, but never hiding either. And now he wondered, was it a kind of suicide? Not the violent kind, but a letting go, a decision to end one story quietly, with grace. In view of a man who had once forgotten her, the law had nothing to charge. The files would close with no inquiry. Cause of death, cardiac arrest, natural, acceptable. But something in Maigret resisted the neatness of it. He stood and walked the corridor toward the basement archives. There, in a filing drawer marked Personnel, Finance Ministry, he searched until he found her name. Lee Danderand, transferred in 1963. No reason listed, just a line. At her request. He stared at the words, not because they told him something new, but because they confirmed something he already knew. She had erased herself. Once, and then, finally, years later, she had chosen to be remembered. It was raining again. Not heavily, but the kind of rain that seemed to settle into every joint. And, Maigret walked home late that evening, his coat collar turned up, the brim of his hat dripping steadily. Paris looked unchanged, the cafes still busy, the yellow lights in the butcher's windows still flickering, the streets still glossy with puddles. When he reached the apartment, Madame Maigret had already set the table. He kissed her cheek, hung his coat near the radiator, and sat down in his armchair for a moment before dinner. She didn't ask about the case. She never did unless he volunteered. But as he removed his damp shoes and settled in, she said gently, "You look tired." Not in the face and the shoulders. He said nothing for a while. Then, it wasn't murder. She waited. She went to the opera. He continued to watch someone who had forgotten her. She died without violence, but not without intention. Some people choose their exits carefully. Madame Maigret said, quietly spooning soup into bowls, not for drama for meaning. He nodded and said no more. Later that night, after she'd gone to bed and the building had fallen into that particular quiet of after midnight, when the city hum disappears into heating pipes and the shuffle of slippers, Maigret sat again in his study with the case file. He reread the note. He looked at the brooch. He imagined her sitting in the red velvet seat, 2 rows behind Fabbert, staring at the back of a man's head. And then something pulled at him, not suspicion, but a thread, a tiny inconsistency too faint to ignore. He reached for the incident report. The usher had said the woman was discovered after the final curtain. She'd sat through the entire performance, unmoving. But one detail stood out now like a smudge on clean glass. Her umbrella had been dry. It had been raining when the performance ended. It had been raining since before the interval. Everyone had left with damp coats and wet shoes, but Madame Dangeron's umbrella, found beside her folded gloves, had been bone-dry. Maigret stood up slowly. His eyes narrowed, not in revelation, but in acknowledgement. Someone had arrived at the scene before the usher. Someone who'd folded her coat, arranged her hands, and perhaps wiped the umbrella dry. The death itself may still have been natural, but the moment of her death had not been private. He arrived the next morning at Fabot's apartment without prior notice. This time, the concierge protested. "Monsieur didn't sleep well. He's not receiving anyone." "Tell him I'm not anyone," Maigret said. "Tell him I'm not here with a question. I'm here with an answer." The wait was longer. The doorman didn't offer coffee. The building, silent the day before, now hummed faintly with activity. A cleaner, a maid, a clock being wound upstairs. Finally, the door opened. Fabot stood in the same clothes as before, shirt unbuttoned at the collar, eyes clear but dry. "Come in," he said, without a trace of surprise. They sat across from each other. No notepad, no file. Maigret simply placed the umbrella on the table between them, found it beside her seat. He said. Fabot didn't flinch. "It's hers." It was dry. So, it had been raining for an hour. Fabot's eyes did not move from the umbrella. Perhaps she carried it as a prop. Something she hadn't used. "She didn't carry props," Maigret replied. She polished her shoes. She brought tea in a thermos. She folded her gloves and fastened her coat. She didn't forget umbrellas. There was no immediate reply. "You found her," Maigret said calmly. "Before the usher. You saw her slumped forward, and you didn't call anyone. You sat beside her, maybe for a minute, maybe longer. You wiped the umbrella dry, as if by reflex. You folded her coat so she would look neat, and then you left." A pause. "She was dead," Fabot said. What would shouting have changed? That she died alone. She didn't. Maigret leaned back. He didn't need a confession. He already had what mattered. "You recognized the brooch," he said softly. "You gave it to her once. A lifetime ago." Fabot exhaled slowly. "Yes, she never wore it. Not once. And yet, there it was. In her hand, almost. She wanted you to see it." Fabot looked at him, then not defensive, not guilty, just hollow. "She waited all these years," he said, "not to be avenged, just to be remembered. I sat there, Inspector. I watched her face. It wasn't angry. It was peaceful. She had won something I never understood." They remained in silence a long while. "I loved her," Fabot said at last, briefly, sharply. "But I was ambitious. I married elsewhere. I moved ahead. She stayed still." Maigret nodded. "She didn't stay still. She lived differently." He stood to leave, placing his hat back on his head. At the door, he turned. "You know I can't charge you with anything." "I know, but you'll carry her silence now." "I already am." On the street again, the rain had stopped. The pavement was drying in patches beneath balconies and awnings. Maigret walked without hurry toward the bridge by the Seine. He watched a barge move slowly under the stone arch, the water rippling gently around it. He didn't feel triumphant, not even resolved, but he felt something settle a tension undone. Later, at the office, he added one line to the file before closing it for good. Death by natural cause, witnessed in silence by the past. No arrest, no trial, no villain, just memory, folded and left behind like a coat on a velvet seat. The file might have been closed, but Maigret's thoughts hadn't. Some cases end tidily. Others don't end at all, they simply drift into memory, leaving a faint crease behind. This one felt like a window left open in winter. No wind, no noise, just a cold that remained long after the door had been shut. He found himself back at the Ministry of Finance 2 mornings later, not because he expected anything specific, but because something about Lee Dangeron's disappearance from her old life still tugged at him. Transfers in civil service were common, especially in the early 60s. But hers had been unusually quiet. No formal complaint, no recommendation, just the phrase, at her request. The building itself hadn't changed much. The marble lobby was still scuffed, the wooden banister still polished once a month, the elevator cage still groaning politely between floors. He asked for old personnel records, and was directed to a small back office on the 3rd floor, where a woman named Madame Rousseau, grey-haired and disinterested, kept a ledger that smelled faintly of glue and decades. She worked in room 212, Rousseau muttered, flipping through the pages. Clerical unit, budget reconciliations, kept mostly to herself, efficient, quiet. Did she leave under difficult circumstances? Maigret asked. Rousseau gave a shrug. Who didn't back then? The ministry swallowed people whole. They either climbed or disappeared. He waited as she pulled a file from the shelf, a thin one, no thicker than a schoolboy's notebook. No complaints, no incidents, but one curious attachment, a letter written in 1963, not by Danderond, but by a woman named Yvette Mercier. Maigret scanned the note. To whom it may concern, I am no longer comfortable working in proximity to Madame Danderond. Her demeanor is unnerving, and her presence causes unnecessary tension among the women in our department. I do not accuse her of anything, but I prefer reassignment. It was signed without flourish, just a name. He looked up at Rousseau. Who was Yvette Mercier? She frowned. That name's familiar. Wait. She returned with another folder. Mercier had worked in the same department for 6 years, transferred. In 1964 to a position in Nantes, married later that year. Her address, now 2 decades outdated, was still listed, 30 for Rue des Batignolles. Maigret visited the building that afternoon. The doorbell worked. A man with reading glasses and a loaf of bread under his arm answered and confirmed that a Madame Mercier did indeed live on the 2nd floor, his mother-in-law. She doesn't get out much, he added, already stepping aside. The apartment smelled of linen and talcum powder. An old dog lay by the radiator, barely raising its head. The woman who greeted him was well into her 70s, with hair too perfectly curled for a day indoors. Her cardigan matched her slippers. Lee Danderond, Maigret said. After they'd exchanged basic pleasantries, the color left her face, but she held her posture. I heard, she said. I read the notice. It was in the paper, just a few lines you wrote about her once. Margaret said. A letter to the ministry. Yvette said nothing. You asked to be transferred. She frightened me, Yvette said at last. Not by action, not by words, just by being there. She saw too much. She had a way of looking at you that made you want to hide. Hide. What? Yvette gave a small, brittle laugh. Yourself, your pettiness, your lies. You knew about Fabbert. Yvette's hands trembled slightly in her lap. Everyone did. It was a whisper. He favored her. Then he didn't. That was all. It took. And you resented her. Yvette's eyes flashed. She didn't care what we thought. She wore the same skirt every Monday, ate the same sandwich. She refused every office collection, every birthday cake. But she listened. Oh, she listened. And people don't like being listened to unless they're being admired. You weren't afraid of her. You were ashamed. Silence. She never asked to be liked. Margaret continued. But you didn't like that she couldn't be cornered. So you filed a letter that made her appear dangerous, and she vanished. I didn't know she'd leave the ministry, Yvette said quietly. I just wanted her moved. Margaret stood. She was moved, and she stayed moved for 20 years. He left without anger. It wasn't needed. The silence he left behind was punishment enough. Back on the street. The clouds had broken slightly. A pale sun lit the rooftops, casting long shadows that sharpened the cracks in the pavement. Margaret stood near a cafe, not ready for coffee, just watching the people pass. So that had been the missing piece, not a villain, not a crime, but a wound, a slow dismissal, a quiet exile. One woman's discomfort had pushed another into silence, and that silence had lasted longer than any accusation. Lee Danderand had not simply died at the opera. She had returned for one night to exist in full again, to sit near the man who once loved her, and show that she hadn't been erased, and someone had seen her. Now, finally. So had Margaret. He made no report. He filed no new statement. But in his drawer, beside his pipe tobacco and worn notebooks, he placed the brooch, not as evidence, as memory. Some stories are not told in courts. They are told in pauses, in the quiet space between sighs, and Margaret knew this. It had not been a case, but a life, and sometimes all you can do is bear witness. A week had passed. Paris had settled into that late autumn rhythm Margaret knew so well. Bare trees, heavy scarves, and the rhythm of umbrellas opening and closing like breathing lungs across every street. The case, if it had ever been a case, had drifted from the newspapers, replaced by ministerial scandals and a fire in the garment district. But Margaret had not forgotten. Not Madame Danderand, not the look in Fabbert's eyes, not the letter from Yvette Mercier. He carried the story in the small moments during walks to the cafe, in the slow roll of his pipe smoke, in the odd sensation that someone had finally asked him not to solve something, but to understand it. On Friday, he returned to the opera. There was no official reason to go, but Margaret believed that not every step in an investigation had to be justified in writing. Some were walks taken only to feel whether the air still carried a shape. He stood in the entrance lobby, The same heavy chandelier above, the same velvet ropes, the same mix of perfume and dust. A matinee crowd moved past him, polite and murmuring. A school group gathered near the ticket kiosk, led by a teacher trying to maintain order without raising her voice. He walked slowly up the staircase, not toward the performance, but toward the balconies. The upper levels were mostly quiet. No show in progress yet. He stepped into the same balcony where Lee Danderend had sat. The red velvet seat had been dusted. The wood of the railing had been wiped clean. Everything reset, but the air felt different. He sat in her seat. From here, he could see box 7 clearly, empty now, its golden railing catching the light in dull flickers. He imagined the moment again. Her coat folded beside her, gloves laid down, the brooch resting where her fingers could touch it. Her eyes, not on the stage, but on the man across from her. What had she felt? Maigret didn't think it was vengeance, nor triumph. Something quieter, a need to be seen not for what she was now, but for who she had once been, not erased. A slow movement caught his eye. A man in a staff uniform and older usher was polishing a nearby handrail. Maigret rose and approached him. "Were you working the night of the performance last week?" he asked. The man straightened his back with some difficulty. "Yes, sir. I always do the Friday evening shows. Upper levels are my domain. Not glamorous, but quieter." Maigret nodded. "Do you remember the woman found here, Madame Danderend?" The usher's eyes darkened. "Yes, I found her, or rather, checked her when she didn't respond to the announcement." "You remember anything odd that night?" The usher rubbed his chin. "I didn't think much of it then. But yes, there was a gentleman well-dressed, in a dark coat. He came out of box 7 before the second intermission. Not the end, midway. That's not unusual. Some guests step out early. Did he seem hurried? No. Calm. But he didn't go toward the exit. He came this way, toward the upper balconies." Maigret felt something shift internally. Not surprise, just confirmation. "Did you see where he went?" "I assumed to the restroom. But afterward, when I came back, he was gone. I remember because the corridor was quiet. I would have heard if he returned." "Did you recognize him?" The usher hesitated. "I've seen him before. A few times. He has one of those faces, unreadable, expensive shoes, but never smiles. Always sits alone." "That would be Fabbert, of course." Maigret thanked him and stood again at the railing of the balcony. So Fabbert had come here, mid-performance. Not at the end. He had come during the music, and she had been alive then, waiting, watching. Perhaps she had seen him approach. Perhaps she had nodded, or said nothing. Maigret could almost feel the scene breathe around him. Back at the station, Maigret opened the file one final time. His pencil hovered over the last page. He added a single sentence. "Witnessed death occurred during Act 2. Not a curtain fall." Then he closed it for good. That evening, he walked home with no intention of discussing the case. But as he and Madame Maigret sat down to supper lentil stew, crusty bread, a bottle already opened, he found himself speaking. "She planned everything," he said. "Even the moment His wife looked at him quietly. She knew the music, not because she liked it, because he did. She timed it so she'd be gone by the final act, so he wouldn't see her die, Madame Maigret said. Without surprise, double quotes, yes, he saw her alive. She made sure of that, and then left him to remember. She forgave him. Maigret looked at her. Not entirely, he said, but she let him carry it without shame. That's something deeper than forgiveness. They ate in silence for a while. Later, as the sky darkened, and the sound of rain returned to the city's rooftops, Maigret stood at the window, pipe unlit in hand. He thought of her final walk, the polished shoes, the folded gloves, the broken clasp on the brooch, the thermos she didn't bring, the seat she chose, and the man across from her. Nothing in it was criminal, but it had weight, the kind of weight only certain silences carry. And so, in a case with no suspects, no charge, no formal wrong, Maigret had still been asked to listen, not to testimony, but to memory. And perhaps, for Lee Danderand, that had always been enough. The following Monday, Maigret found himself on Boulevard de Richehuat, walking without any true destination. He carried no folder, no summons, no intention, only a lingering sense that the story of Madame Danderand had not fully emptied itself yet. The city had settled into a grey calm, like a breath held between seasons. Shopkeepers swept wet leaves into the gutters. Students shuffled past with collar buttons fastened, and no one speaking above the volume of footsteps. He turned a corner, not thinking, and came upon a small cafe with frosted windows and no music. Just the clink of teaspoons and the low murmur of older men playing cards in the back. It was the kind of place where nothing ever changed, and nobody minded that Maigret took a seat by the window. The owner, recognizing the coat and the face, brought over coffee without asking. As he stirred the sugar slowly into the cup, Maigret noticed something odd in the pocket of his overcoat, a small, smooth shape. He reached in and found a single coat button, dark brown, flat-edged, still holding a frayed loop of thread. It wasn't his. He turned it over in his hand. Something familiar. The buttons on Madame Danderand's coat had looked like this. He remembered because they were polished, as if she'd wiped them down before stepping out. She had folded that coat herself deliberately. The usher had found it beside her. Had the button come loose in the struggle of dying? Or had someone removed it? Maigret didn't believe in accidents, not when the gesture was this small, this precise. He remembered the umbrella dry, the coat folded, and now a missing button. If someone had sat beside her after her death, touched her coat, adjusted it, tucked it around her to preserve her dignity, could they have broken it off unintentionally? Perhaps. But then, why pocket it? Why not leave it lying there? He let the buttons sit on the table as he drank his coffee. It wasn't evidence, not in the official sense, but it was an object out of place. Just then, a shadow fell across the table. Inspector. It was Fabert. He wore a charcoal overcoat, same as the one from the performance, and a scarf tucked carefully at the collar. He looked neither distressed nor surprised. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the empty seat. Maigret nodded. The silence between them lasted several moments. Fabbert looked at the button on the table, then at Maigret's face. He didn't ask. "I didn't call you," Maigret said finally. "I know, but I thought perhaps you would be here. You came to the opera during the second act. You left your box early. You approached her seat. You stayed long enough to fold her coat." Fabbert nodded. "I wanted her to appear composed. She deserved that. You could have walked away," Maigret said, unseen. "I did, but not right away. And this—" Maigret pushed the button slightly forward. Fabbert didn't touch it. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe it came off when I straightened the coat. I put it in my pocket without thinking, perhaps out of habit. I used to do that with her, you know, when she lost things. Hairpins, earrings, little objects. I'd find them and save them for her. She said I always noticed the wrong details." Maigret nodded slowly. "You've carried this for a week," he said. Fabbert looked out the window, watching two men loading crates of oranges onto a small delivery cart. "She didn't want forgiveness," he said. "She wanted to be remembered. But that doesn't mean I feel less guilty." "It's not guilt," Maigret said. "It's recognition. She was stronger than all of us." Fabbert murmured. "None of us knew it then. She had no need to be liked. That frightened people." Maigret thought of the letter from Yvette, Mercia, of the silver brooch, of the untouched thermos drying in Clotilde's sink. She had a life. "After you," Maigret said. "It may have been quiet, but it wasn't empty. I never imagined it was." Fabbert replied, "I imagined nothing. That was the problem." A waitress came by and topped up their cups. Neither man touched the fresh coffee. "Why did you come here?" Maigret asked. "To leave something," Fabbert said. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a small envelope on the table. Inside was a photograph. Young Lee, taken candidly. Her eyes focused on something outside the frame. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't unhappy. "She gave this to me once," Fabbert said. "I found it yesterday, in a book I hadn't opened in years." He slid it toward Maigret. "She'd want you to keep it. You, not me." Maigret looked at it for a long time. Then he folded the envelope and placed it inside his coat. Fabbert rose. "No one will ever ask about her," he said. "Not officially. No family. No scandal. Just a death in a velvet seat. She knew that." Maigret replied. "And still, she showed up." Fabbert nodded. Outside. The rain had begun again. Maigret remained in the cafe after Fabbert left. The button sat between his cup and the edge of the table, a quiet object, neither lost nor found. Some deaths speak loudly, others are acts of grace. He took the button and the photograph and slipped them into his coat pocket, not for the file, for himself, later that night, as he returned home. Madame Maigret met him at the door with her usual gentle greeting. "You look like you've been speaking to ghosts," she said softly. "I have," Maigret replied, and they listened. The next morning brought no urgency, just drizzle, the kind that crept sideways under awnings and made umbrellas feel like wasted effort. Maigret left the Quai des Orfèvres a little after 8, not because he had business, but because something inside him refused to sit still. The case had no suspect, No charges, and no legal relevance anymore. Yet it followed him quietly, like a pair of footsteps behind him that stopped every time he turned. He had stopped opening the file. He already knew everything in it. Instead, he walked the streets around the 9th arrondissement, near the opera, retracing steps he hadn't been assigned to follow, not to question, just to watch. It was how he understood people, not with dossiers or diagrams, but by standing. In their shadow, around 10, he found himself outside the Hettelvane Dame, a modest but respectable place facing a narrow square. He had passed it before, never with reason. Today, the name had appeared in his memory from the edges of Madame Dangeron's pension records. A hotel address listed once in her employment file, not as a residence, but as an emergency contact. No name attached, just the address. He went inside. The lobby was small, lined with walnut paneling and a scent of shoe polish and old newspapers. A man in his 70s stood behind the desk, wearing a waistcoat too tight for his frame. He looked up with a polite frown. "I'm not here officially," Maigret said, "and I'm not here for trouble." The man didn't ask who he was. Something in Maigret's presence answered that already. "I'm looking for someone," Maigret continued, or rather for the memory of someone. He placed a photograph on the desk. The one Fabert had handed him, the young Lee Danderand, unsmiling, watching something far away. The man stared at it longer than expected. "She stayed here," he said. Maigret didn't interrupt. "Not for long, maybe a few nights, but she came more than once, always in late autumn. Booked the same room, top floor, view of the square. She mentioned why? No, and I didn't ask. She was the kind of woman you didn't press for answers. She paid quietly, never asked for anything, didn't leave messes." Maigret nodded toward the old brass key rack behind him. "Still have the ledger?" The man pulled out a thick volume from beneath the counter and turned through pages with care. "There," he said, tapping with a cracked fingernail. "Madame L.D. she signed it that way. No full name. Dates, every November. Same week, over the course of 5 years. Then she stopped." Maigret ran his thumb along the edge of the paper. "Did she receive mail here?" The man blinked. "Yes, just once. I remember because she waited for it, for 3 days, and it never came. She left the morning after without checking out properly, just slipped the key on the desk and walked away. No return visits? None that I saw." Maigret stood there, absorbing the weight of what wasn't said. The woman who waited for a letter that never arrived, the choice to return each year, not out of expectation, but ritual. He stepped out of the hotel without a word, standing under the awning as the rain gathered in slow rivulets at the corners of the roof. He took out his notebook and marked one line. She returned 5 times. Then never again. Not until the opera. It was late by the time he returned to the quay. The corridors were quieter now. Most of the morning cases had been logged, the afternoon ones not yet begun. He stood by the window of his office, watching. The city smeared itself into fog. Janvier entered a moment later, carrying a folded sheet. "You'll want to see this," he said. "It's from the postal inspector." Maigret opened it. It was a confirmation. No mail addressed to Lee Danderend had ever been delivered to Hethelvane Dame. After 1971, he folded it and slipped it into the same envelope as the hotel ledger. Copy he'd borrowed. Another thread, another silence. That evening, Maigret walked home a little later than usual. Madame Maigret had set the table and poured 2 glasses of the red wine they'd been saving for the holidays. She said nothing when he entered. As they ate, she finally asked, "Is it finished now?" Maigret wiped his mouth with his napkin. "Almost, but not completely." "No," he admitted. She waited for a letter that never came, from someone who no longer wrote letters, and when she stopped waiting, she waited somewhere else in front of him, and he never knew what to say. Maigret nodded. She came back not to speak, but to remind him of silence, the kind he had chosen, and she had worn for years. Later that night, he opened the photograph one more time, looked at her eyes, the crease in the corner of her mouth, the small strand of hair not tucked behind her ear. She had not posed, she had endured. He placed the photo into his private drawer. Not evidence, not memorabilia, just truth. It rained. The morning Maigret closed the file. Not a dramatic storm, not the kind that changed the rhythm of the city, just a thin, persistent drizzle that softened the outlines of buildings and blurred the sky to the color of tin. From his office window at Quai d'Or-Favors, Maigret watched the buses pass with wipers dragging lazily across their windshields. The occasional pedestrian ducking under storefronts, as if the day had come too early for them. The file on Lee. Danderend sat on the corner of his desk, bound but unsealed. The paper inside had stopped mattering days ago. The story was no longer in the documents. It was in the spaces between them. He opened it one final time, not to read, but to touch. Inside were only a few pages. Her employment history, the usher's statement, the note she had written on plain stationery, the silver brooch in a small envelope, and now, folded at the back, the hotel ledger copy from the Hethelvane Dame. The button he had found in his coat pocket, he placed in the center. Not for evidence. For weight. He sat quietly with it for some time. Then, without announcement, he stood, lifted the file, and left the building. He walked to Gare Saint-Lazare, slowly, coat collar turned up, pipe in his pocket, but unlit. He wasn't going anywhere. He just wanted to see a place where people waited, where departure and absence existed side by side. The station was alive with soft chaos, porters calling names, boots clacking on stone, steam curling from under old trains like the breath of something tired but enduring. He bought a coffee from a vendor and leaned against a pillar, watching strangers embrace and part. A man kissed his wife's cheek and promised to write. A woman stood alone by a timetable, checking the same time over and over. An older couple argued gently over which platform was theirs. Every one of them imagined they were seen. Every one of them carried a story. And none of them knew a woman had once died in a velvet seat, not 50 minutes from here, with a coat folded. Beside her, waiting for nothing but to be visible. That was what had stayed with Maigret most, not the opera, not Fabert, not the brooch or the tea thermos, but the dignity of her choice. She had decided where she would sit, what she would wear, Who would see her, and how silence would carry more than any confrontation? He thought of Fabbert, walking through the rain in his dark coat, never arrested, never even accused but changed nonetheless. The guilt he carried was not judicial. It was emotional, internal. The slow-burning kind that wakes a man years after forgetting why he closed a door and never opened it again. She had not come for revenge. She had come to be remembered by the only person who had once claimed to see her and had then forgotten how to look. Maigret knew there would be no mention of the case. In the department's monthly summary, it would not be listed in the internal circular. There had been no autopsy beyond routine. The cause was still heart failure. Everything else had happened in the margins. But the margins were where truth often lived. He took out the brooch one more time, still in its envelope. He held it in his palm like something fragile, not valuable. The engraving on the back RF barely visible in the grey light. He thought of returning it to Fabbert, but no, that wasn't right. Fabbert had given his part of the story already, willingly or not. The photograph, the button, the silence, that was all he had to offer. Instead, Maigret crossed the street to a post box. He slipped the envelope inside. No return address, no note, just the brooch, mailed without destination. Let it vanish, like the letter she had waited for and never received. Let it pass into someone else's pocket by chance, and live as a mystery. With no context. Back at Quai des Orfèvres, he returned to his desk. The folder was still slightly damp at the corners. He placed it in his bottom drawer, not in the archive cabinet, and closed it with quiet finality. Madame Maigret was already waiting when he returned home for lunch. She had made endives with ham again, just as she had on the day it began. The table was set neatly. A small fire flickered in the stove. They ate without conversation, not because there was nothing to say, but because what mattered had already been felt. Afterward, as they sipped the remains of their coffee, she asked, "Will you write anything down?" "No," Maigret said. "It wouldn't be understood." "But you understood it." "I hope so," she smiled. "That's more than most can claim." That night, before bed, Maigret stood at the window once more, listening to the city dampen into stillness. In the distance, a siren cried once, and then fell quiet. He thought of her seat in the opera house, whether someone else would sit there again next week, watching a tragedy that wasn't theirs. He thought of the button, of the folded coat, of the silver thermos left behind in Montmartre, of a letter never written. And then he turned away from the window, removed his coat, and allowed the quiet to settle over him, not with burden, but with peace. Because some cases aren't solved, they are heard, and some endings are not justice, but remembrance. 3 weeks had passed. Paris was already shifting into winter's edge, windows shuttered earlier, coats buttoned tighter, and cafes growing louder in the late afternoons as people lingered over their warmth. Maigret hadn't thought of the case every day, but it had never left him either. It sat quietly in a part of his mind reserved for lives that hadn't asked to be saved, only witnessed. It was a Thursday when a letter arrived at his office. The envelope was cream-colored, carefully sealed, and carried no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and on it, A name, Clotilde Maturin. No message. No explanation. Just her name, written in faint blue ink as if whispered. He visited her that afternoon. She lived in the same Montmartre apartment, though this time she was already at the door before he knocked, her scarf tied tightly around her head, her mouth pressed in a line. "I thought it was over," she said as she let him in. "It is," Margaret replied gently, "but sometimes an end has corners." She sat slowly, as though weighed down by a thought she had rehearsed many times. "I lied to you," she said plainly, not about knowing her, but about something she left behind. Margaret waited. "She gave me a second note," Clotilde continued. "Told me to destroy it after she died. But I didn't. I couldn't. I didn't understand it then, but after what you told me about the opera, about the man, I thought maybe you should have it." She handed him a folded page. "Brittle at the crease. Maigret. Read it slowly. I am not going to die with anger. I am not going to die to be pitied. But I will sit where he once saw me, and I will be still. He will feel it, not like thunder, like a button missing from a coat, something small, something late." He folded the note carefully. She didn't hate him, Clotilde said. She hated being erased. Margaret stood, thanked her, and stepped into the cold street. The note held loosely in his hand like a thought not yet spoken. That evening, he walked past the Opera Garnier. The lights were up. The crowd outside murmured in soft excitement. Collars turned high. Ticket stubs held between gloved fingers. A poster near the entrance announced Les Troyens again. He stood across the street and looked up. The left balcony was lit. It had been cleaned, polished, reset. New patrons would sit there. They would fidget during the overture, unwrap candies to loudly shift in their seats. They would not know a woman had once chosen that very spot to end not her life but her invisibility. He did not go in. There was no need. Back home, Madame Maigret was darning a sock near the fire. She looked up as he entered, but said nothing at first. "You were out late." "I had something to finish," he replied. She waited. He handed her the note. She read it in silence, then folded it again. She found her moment. She said softly, "Yes," and gave it shape. Later, Maigret sat in his chair, the fire low, his pipe unlit. In his drawer was the last entry for the file, the note. He did not submit it. He placed it with the button and the photo. 3 objects, all quiet, all final. And for the first time since the investigation began, he felt something settle, not triumph, not even closure, but respect. He did not mourn her. He remembered her, and in that she had already won.